A thin mist clings to the temple stones as if the air itself remembers a hand that once traced the corners of this place. Lantern light slides across carved grooves. Each line holds the echo of a chisel and an instruction never written in any known tongue. You can almost hear the architect's breath in the hollow between the walls. Beneath the surface of this silence, there is movement, the slow, methodical scrape of conservators at work, the measured click of surveying instruments, the occasional murmur of a local guide who still calls the ruins by a name older than maps. No one knows who drew the first line of the blueprint that governed these stones, and that not knowing sits heavy like a stone lintel over every doorway. The enigma deepens when you touch the plaster and feel not only calcified lime but a faint roughness, incongruous with the polished facades elsewhere in the region. Microscopic analysis later reveals a tempering mixture unlike local standards: crushed shell, a resin that resists known solvent tests, and mineral inclusions whose isotopic ratios hint at sources far beyond the valley. Preliminary lab scan, recent survey. How did those ingredients travel here, and why were they chosen with such precise intention? A single circle, incised and almost erased by wind, repeats across lintels and stair edges, the motif that keeps surfacing in the notes of every team that has passed through. Some call it merely a mason's mark. Others whisper that it is a sigil, a preserved symbol of construction knowledge, a fingerprint of the temple architect. If you stood here among the mist and stone, what would you believe? The first modern record arrives as a sketch in a colonial ledger dated 1839, Archive Notations, 1839. An artillery officer with more interest in antiquities than in cannon fire describes a plan incised on stone, as though a draftsman had carved his paper into rock. His drawing is rough, but the pattern, the circle within an offset grid, appears unmistakable. Subsequent explorers corroborate the layout yet give differing accounts of its orientation. One reports an alignment to sunrise at the winter solstice. Another notes a deviation that suggests an intentional axial offset. Field Notes, 1922. Expedition Journal, 1951. The records disagree, but they agree on one point: the plan survives where paper plans do not. Short paragraphs fall like stones in a dry riverbed: built, abandoned, buried, found. Archaeology operates in fragments, and this site yields them with maddening thrift. Floors uncovered one season vanish beneath collapsing vaults the next. A column section reveals a stamped symbol, later sections show tool marks inconsistent with the same quarry. Radiocarbon samples from adjacent organic deposits give a range, centering around the 5th to 7th century CE. Radiocarbon lab, calibrated ranges. Yet thermoluminescence dates on a fired clay tile near the foundation return a surprisingly earlier signal, nudging the origin backward by centuries. Thermoluminescence test, recent. Are we looking at a multi-phase construction, a tradition passed through apprentices across generations, or a single, remarkably long-lived workshop that preserved an exacting architectural language? No one knows why the blueprint uses semicircles where orthodoxy would demand right angles. The plan prefers arcs and interleaving rings, geometries that distribute stress differently, that suggest a knowledge of load distribution and resonance perhaps beyond local practice. Structural analysis shows that the arches here do not merely span space, they tune it. During seasonal winds, the central nave hums at a low frequency, a bell-like tone that seems to reinforce certain vaults while leaving others trembling. Acoustics Survey, 2019. Could the architect have built with sound in mind? Perhaps the greatest mystery is not where the stones came from, but what they were meant to do once assembled. A child's handprint pressed into wet plaster many centuries ago anchors the human scale. Someone small stood where overseers may have stood, and their presence is fossilized here like a datum point. That tiny print reappears in later stratigraphies, as though successive workers used the same template, aligning fresh mortar to the same imperfect thumb. This repetition implies continuity, a living tradition or a guarded secret of apprenticeship. What oath bound those hands to a single way of making? At the heart of the complex lies a chamber whose ceiling bears a blueprint not in ink but carved in low relief, a plan of this very temple, with corridors and niches rendered in miniature. The miniature includes elements that no longer survive above, a corridor turned to rubble, a stepped platform absent from the tell. Whoever carved this reduced plan had intimate knowledge of the whole. Close inspection shows tool marks that match mason's signatures found on outer walls, linking the model to the workforce. Conservation report, recent. Why is there a plan inside the building rather than in an archive or on papyrus? Did the architect intend a living blueprint, one that belonged to the stones themselves, unrecorded in transit media? Short sentences. The blueprint insists. Shadows answer. The people who built this place left few words. Where inscriptions survive, they are formulaic, dedications to deities with titles that refuse neat translation. Linguists propose a substratum language mixed with later loan phrases. Linguistic Survey, 2008. Fragments of glyphs appear on lintels, arranged in repeating grids that could be mnemonic devices rather than sentences. One glyph, resembling the repeated workshop circle, flanks phrases that otherwise read as offerings to structure and shelter. Is it a guild mark, built by the circle workshop, or a theological symbol promising protection to the built world? Legends take root when the dry facts cannot be coaxed into wholeness. Local elders tell of an architect who drew his plans in dreams and commanded stones to obey. In their language, the architect is called Al-Qadim, a name that translates roughly as the one who steps first. Local pronunciation, Al-Qadim. They say the architect listened to springs and counted the turning of seasons in the mortar mix. Folklore is not evidence, yet it carries a kind of memory. Story-wrapped hints handed through generations where maps and labs leave gaps. What is the value of a story that preserves a practice rather than a date? The construction techniques are a study in controlled anomalies. Blocks fitted with millimeter tolerances bear tooling marks executed by chisels sharper than any used locally until recent times. Microscopic striations reveal a sequence: coarse shaping, fine abrasion, then a final burnishing that produces a sheen resisting weathering. The burnish contains traces of an oil derived from an extinct plant species, identified by a single residue bead in a sample. Residue analysis, 2017. That plant's nearest relatives are found miles away and in a different ecological zone. Who cultivated such material, and why incorporate it into a stone finish? Short sentences echo in the vaulted air. Who cultivated the oil? Who measured the arc? There is a practical genius here as well as an aesthetic one. Rain is diverted through hidden gutters that channel water into subterranean cisterns. Those cisterns feed a system of capillary fabrics embedded under altar stones. Hydraulic Survey, 2016. The capillary system moderates humidity and stabilizes temperature, preserving delicate pigments once applied to the walls. A pigment fragment still clings to a niche. Ultraviolet fluorescence reveals a palette of indigo and a near black derived from manganese oxides. Pigment Analysis, 2020. The presence of an advanced environmental control system complicates the narrative of a hurriedly built cult site. It suggests long-term occupancy and deliberate conservation, a built-in plan to keep the sacred image intact through centuries. Some suggest the blueprint encodes astronomical information. Lines carved into thresholds map to heliacal risings of stars that guided agricultural cycles in neighboring regions. Astronomical Alignment Study, 2011. Others point out that the inner sanctum's central ring aligns with a star that no longer occupies the same position due to precession, implying either an ancient alignment or a ritual that intentionally offsets cosmology. Astronomical Recalibration, 2015. Which reading holds more power, the practical or the cosmic? Perhaps both are true, embedded in the same stroke. Short and quiet, perhaps both are true. Excavation reveals a curious absence. No mass graves, no evidence of hurried abandonment, no sign of violent overthrow. Instead, layers of carefully placed debris show orderly dismantling, beams reused in distant settlements, decorative stones repurposed in civic walls, certain carved slabs deliberately broken and buried beneath floors. Archaeological Stratigraphy Report, recent. This pattern implies a community that managed its own decline with ritual care, preserving some parts while sacrificing others. Why decommission a temple so thoughtfully? What decisions weigh a society toward removal rather than preservation? A rumor persists in scholarly circles, a lost guild ledger, a set of plans recorded on sheets coated in a wax that resists the decomposition seen in papyrus. No ledger has been found, but faint impressions on a limestone slab suggest the transfer of wet wax or clay impressions used as working drawings. Experiment Replication, 2022. The slab bears impressions of proportional systems, modules repeated across doorways and plinths, consistent with the circle template used throughout. Could such physical templates have been standard-issue tools for master builders? Did a guild control their distribution as a form of trade secret? Short question: who guarded the gate of knowledge? There are human traces beyond craft, a scattering of personal objects left in niches, spindle whorls, a child's bead, a metal awl, each placed with intention rather than carelessness. These objects read like bookmarks in lives once lived, a pattern of daily practices woven into ritual space. The bead is of a style produced hundreds of kilometers away, while the awl's metal composition matches or from a remote mountain range. Material provenance, 2018. The temple, then, was not an isolated monument but a hub and a network of exchange. How did such networks sustain the transfer of both ideas and materials that shaped this blueprint? A short, vivid image. A mason stops at dusk, finger tracing the circle, whispering a name into the stone. Fieldwork turns up unexpected technology. In a collapsed vestibule, conservators find fragments of a lens, small, sand-polished glass with a refractive curvature suggestive of magnification. Artifact Catalog, 2014. The fragment is not large enough to be a spectacle, but its optical qualities could serve as a focusing tool for fine incisions or pigment application. The idea that ancient hands had access to focused light for delicate work reshapes assumptions about workshop practices. If magnification was in play, the precision tolerances become less mystifying. If not, then the precision speaks to a different kind of mastery. Short and insistent, precision or magnification. When researchers attempt to reconstruct the design logic, they encounter modular systems recurring across the city's architecture, a repeating ratio, an interlock of arcs and tangents that resembles an ancient geometric treatise executed in stone. Geometric Analysis, 2021. The pattern admits no simple cultural attribution. It draws on techniques known to several ancient schools yet synthesizes them into a singular idiom. Perhaps the architect was not local but a traveler, an itinerant master who absorbed and reworked knowledge. Or perhaps the community itself evolved a hybrid aesthetic through trade and migration. What produces such synthesis? Migration, conquest, or deliberate cosmopolitanism? The motif returns, the circle within a circle like a fingerprint. One of the most vexing discoveries is a suite of iron pins set into masonry joints, not random clamps but precisely placed dowels whose metallurgy includes an alloying element not yet observed in contemporaneous artifacts from the region. Metallurgical Analysis, 2019. The pins show signs of controlled cooling, suggesting knowledge of quenching that manipulates crystalline structure for strength. Who taught such metallurgical control? Was this an in-house innovation or a transferred technique from afar? Short line: who taught the quenching? There are also errant myths that must be handled with care. A fringe narrative, circulated online and by a few colorful guides, claims the blueprint contains encoded maps to subterranean vaults filled with gold. These stories circulate because people wish them to be true. They are modern wishes applied to ancient work. As a rule, no credible excavation has found caches of treasure commensurate with such claims. The conservation record insists on a different truth. Wealth here was expressed in craft knowledge and network ties, not in bullion hidden beneath tiles. Quiet statement: stories are human, but evidence is the faithful ledger. The modern team arrives with a suite of non-invasive techniques that were impossible to earlier explorers: ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR mapping, drone photogrammetry. The first LiDAR sweep reveals alignments invisible from the ground, shadowed terraces that mirror the plan of the inner sanctum, a radial array of outworks that extend the temple's influence across the landscape. LiDAR Survey, 2020. Where the eye sees ruin, the skin shows coherence. A landscape shaped according to an overarching design language. How many places have designs waiting to be seen only by machine vision? Short urgent: what else is invisible until we look differently? Teams debate interpretation in makeshift tents. One scholar proposes the architect's blueprint functions as a mnemonic map for ritual movement, a choreography of processions timed to align with acoustic and light effects. Another argues for a civic function, a central administrative hub whose symbolic gestures encoded legal or economic practices. The disagreements are not petty. They reveal how evidence supports multiple coherent narratives, each with implications for how we today understand social complexity in the past. When the past yields ambiguity, how do we choose which story to foreground? The motif whispers again. The blueprint is a script read differently by each reader. At night the temple exhales a faint, sustained tone when wind channels through a broken clear story. Local storytellers claim the sound is the architect speaking, or perhaps the stones remembering the hand that first drew the circle. Scientists record the frequency, map the resonant nodes, and offer models grounded in physics that predict which arches will survive stress and which will fail. Both accounts can live in the same space. The story and the model are complementary ways to engage a place that resists simple explanation. Short thought, story and model, hand in hand. Excavation of a peripheral workshop uncovers tools unexpectedly standardized. Chisels cut to identical lengths, templates with matching perforations, a cache of nails of the same gauge. Standardization implies control, training, and perhaps a regulatory authority that maintained quality across projects. Workshop Inventory, 2015. The implication unsettles easy assumptions about decentralized craft in the era. Someone, somewhere, enforced a code. An authority that instruments aesthetic choices could be a guild, a state office, or perhaps a cloistered brotherhood dedicated to the preservation of building rights. Which is likelier in a landscape of traded goods and shared motifs? Short pause. Which guardians kept the code? Absences again puncture the narrative. No formal archives, no tablets with administrative tallies. Yet the architecture itself speaks figures, as if columns and doorways substituted for ledgers, encoding commitments in material form rather than parchment. Consider, for a moment, the possibility that the blueprint is an embodied record, a durable, public contract carved in stone, readable by those initiated into its grammar. If knowledge must survive beyond the fragility of paper, perhaps the blueprint is the most durable contract a community could make with its future. Short, contemplative, the stones remember contracts. The research horizon widens with each method applied. Photogrammetric models allow virtual reconstruction of lost rooms. Isotopic mapping traces distant quarries. Micro-CT scans reveal construction phases in cross-section. Yet every new technique opens further questions. A reconstructed niche shows pigments layered in a timeline that contradicts earlier assumptions about iconographic change. Isotopes point to a supply chain including regions thought politically distant at the time. Science clarifies and complicates in equal measure. Short line, clarification breeds more questions. The circle is both motif and method. Geometrically, it dictates proportions. Symbolically, it acts as a signature. Sometimes it appears alone. Sometimes it frames a handprint. Occasionally it overlays a carved map. Its consistent recurrence argues for deliberate choice across generations. No one knows when that motif first stitched itself into the craft tradition, but its endurance suggests a doctrine, technique and meaning commingled. Short question, what doctrine binds a circle through centuries? And there remains the human friction of modernity. Looters, development pressures, the hunger for flat land to build houses or plant crops. Conservationists warn that the site's integrity is fragile. Modern roads channel water differently, destabilizing terraces. Funding cycles ebb and flow. The blueprint, after centuries of survival, now depends on fragile institutions and the goodwill of people who live among the ruins. How will our era steward what earlier hands preserved with ritual care? Short appeal. Stewardship is our responsibility. At the center, in a quiet recess, a child's scribble etches a name that could be their own or a later visitor's, a line of letters worn to near obliteration. A conservator photographs it, enhances the contrast, and for a moment the room is full of the ghost of a voice. Small acts, names, beads, thumbprints, anchor the sweeping theories to lives that touched mortar and clay. In the end, perhaps the blueprint mattered most because it was meant to be used by people, to be walked, to guide hands, to hold community memory. A hand lights schemes over a concentric carving and catches on the faint gloss of old burnish. There, the stone still drinks the light like a memory. They dig where the blueprint insists a stair once ran, and the dust yields a whisper of mortar and a ring of ash, an old hearth, or a ceremonial fire laid to rest beneath floor levels. The ash contains charred seeds. Flotation returns pulses of a grain domesticated far from the valley. Flotation results recent. Someone here planted tastes from elsewhere and baked them into domestic life. What does a table of distant grain tell us about the people who lived beneath the plan's shadow? Short, precise. The ash remembers a dinner. A middle-aged conservator, sleeves rolled, traces the mortar seams with a bamboo skewer and talks quietly into a logbook, noting microstratigraphy and contamination risk. Nearby, a younger field archaeologist trains a 3D scanner on a fallen capital, laughing softly when the mesh fills in a missing volute with uncanny accuracy. Their voices rise and fall across the courtyard like a duet, methodical, human, attentive. These are the hands that read the blueprint now, and they bring instruments that would have been pure sorcery to an earlier generation of scholars. The city around the temple offers its own blueprint. The streets arc in concentric bands that shadow the temple's rings, and old irrigation channels trace geometry that might be pedestrian or might be an urban echo of the architect's plan. Satellite images from the late 20th and early 21st centuries reveal patterns obscured on foot, terraces forming spiral-like catchments, watchtowers set at harmonic intervals, and field boundaries that conform to an invisible radiating module. Remote Sensing Study, 2018. When civilization writes itself in land, patterns persist harder than stories. Not every clue is architectural. In a sunken storeroom, conservators find a wooden box sealed with pitch. Inside, linens folded with careful hands host a tiny stack of tokens, thin discs of fired clay, each stamped with a simple circle. The tokens are not currency as commonly understood. Rather, they seem to function as workshop tallies or rite markers, one smooth at the edges as if handled often. One bears a faint fingerprint preserved in the clay, the ridges lending an intimacy to the administrative life that architecture alone cannot convey. Who counted with these discs? Who authorized the exchange they represent? During a week of rain, the temple takes on a new voice. Water runs along seams that are otherwise dry, and the acoustic profile shifts. Vaults that sang in wind now vibrate with the drip's cadence. Researchers record these transient harmonics and compare them to earlier acoustic logs. Differences suggest minor shifts in structural tension, perhaps caused by centuries of micro-movements and the slow creep of loads. The temple is alive to weather in the way a living thing is alive to breath. Are we listening to architecture aging, or to architecture remembering? A denser paragraph follows. The team debates the sequence of events leading to the careful decommissioning we found. One scenario imagines a conscious ritual dismantling tied to political reform. As a new polity rises, it absorbs the old temple's cadres and recycles material in a public rebranding of space. Another scenario proposes a slow economic realignment. Trade routes change, patronage dries, and the community repurposes stone to fund new priorities. Each theory finds support in different classes of evidence: ceramic phases, coin hoards, and settlement surveys, and each leaves holes the other cannot fill. Settlement Survey, 2012. The truth may be a palimpsest of reasons rather than a single cause. Short question: which truth fits the holes? In labs, cross-sections of plaster reveal layered rituals of surface treatment, pigment, sealant, a wash that includes a pulverized mineral used in distant metallurgy, then a protective film whose microstructure matches resin residues from coastal shrubs. Microstratigraphy Lab, 2021. The sequence reads like a conservation protocol assembled before conservationists existed. Who taught the builders the chemistry of preservation? Was it trial and error refined over generations, a transmitted manual, or the cross-pollination of itinerant artisans? A brief, tactile paragraph. A conservator's brush lifts a flake of indigo, and the color blooms like a blue memory before fading under the studio light. Ornamental motifs invite cross-cultural comparisons. The interlacing rings recall a decorative grammar seen in a coastal polis, while certain masonry clamps resemble hardware used in inland mountain fortresses. Comparative morphology suggests networks of exchange that stretched across varied terrains and social spheres. Comparative Morphology, 2016. The blueprint, therefore, might be less an isolated act of genius and more a node where multiple technical vocabularies converge. But even convergence demands a center, a place where decisions are made and practices codified. Short line: convergence needs a center. In a subsurface chamber, archaeologists find a sequence of graffiti, quick marks left by hands moving through the space over time. These range from playful doodles to more formal notations, modular marks that echo the temple's proportions, initials scratched and over-scratched, and a series of tally marks that may record labor days or offerings. In their cumulative ambiguity, the graffiti are human punctuation, moments when daily life scribbled across sacred form. How often do our own margins become the evidence for tomorrow? Short reflective question: what will our margins say? The local oral historian brings a story that complicates the tidy frameworks of the scholars. She speaks of a migration event recorded in a lace of songs, a caravan that arrived with a master builder, she says, who was welcomed and given authority to set rules in exchange for his knowledge. Her tale names no dates, but it maps memories of craft and names of families who still claim descent from the Masonry Guild. Oral memory often compresses time and enlarges personalities, yet it preserves associations, lineage, skill, obligation, that archives rarely record. Could this be the social mechanism that kept the blueprint alive? A longer, evidential paragraph. When the team tested the alloy composition of the dowel pins against scrap metal from a suspected satellite site, the isotopic fingerprints matched. This cross-site identity implies either centralized production and distribution or a tight-knit network maintaining metallurgical standards. Metallurgy here is not accidental, it is a hallmark of a regulated craft tradition. Were there workshops dedicated to particular tasks that issued standardized components? Evidence leans that way. Short reminder: evidence leans. Time and again, the site yields artifacts that complicate chronology. A lacquered wooden object sealed in a hermetic niche yields a radiocarbon date several centuries earlier than the layer above it. Radiocarbon lab, calibrated. The best explanation posits reuse of heirloom objects, prestige items kept and recontextualized across generations, yet such reuse implies cultural choices about memory and continuity. The blueprint, then, operates across temporal registers, a living plan for current use and a curated archive for identity. Short sentence: continuity with memory. Researchers working on the acoustic model publish a provisional paper arguing that the temple's hollows paired with specific doorway dimensions create a deliberate amplitude filter, amplifying low frequencies associated with human vocal registers used in ritual speech. Acoustic Modeling, 2022. If confirmed, this would suggest an embodied performative logic, architecture staged to carry and color the human voice. The idea nudges ritual studies and architectural history toward each other. If stones shape sound, then sound shapes ritual. The blueprint would thus be as much a script for performance as for structure. Short provocative question: what does it mean to design for voice? Not all moments are sterile. One evening, the team hosts a community listening session in the partially restored nave. Elders, schoolchildren, and conservators sit in a ring. Someone plays a reed instrument, and the room answers with a low resonance that makes the lanterns tremble. The children laugh. The elders speak in metaphors. In that shared listening, the blueprint moves from the printed mesh of a 3D model into a social object, an arena for shared memory and debate. Preservation here is not only technical, it is cultural practice renewed. A denser reflection: the project's ethics emerge in these meetings. Who decides what to restore and what to leave as ruin? Who owns the right to interpret the blueprint for viewers who will never touch the stones? Conservation becomes a negotiation between distant funding bodies, local stakeholders, and the heritage of peoples who live with the ruins. The answers are as contested as the past itself. In negotiating stewardship, present communities assert continuity and agency against a narrative that might otherwise relegate them to the margins. Short, sober line: Stewardship is contested. Far from the excavation, a graduate student pores over an early colonial sketch and notices a notation no one had read as more than cursive flourish, a compass bearing that points not to sunrise but toward a cluster of natural springs 3 kilometers downstream. Field teams follow the line and find faint terracing around those springs, evidence of managed wetlands that would have supported the temple's water needs. Hydrological Survey, 2019. A seemingly trivial notation in a dusty ledger becomes a clue that reconnects the temple to a landscape of infrastructure. How many such tiny notations wait unnoticed in archives, their import concealed by hurried hands? Short image, a pencil stroke that opens a valley. Arguments proliferate, of course. Some scholars remain skeptical of grand integrative interpretations and urge restraint. Patterns can be coincidental. Echoes in the ground can mislead. The conservative approach insists on robust, replicable evidence before asserting the social scale implied by a centralized blueprint. The debate is productive because it forces methodological rigor. Yet the human hunger for narrative means integrative theories will always have appeal. Which approach best serves the facts? Short question, rigor or narrative? In a small storage room, conservators find a folded register, thin wood sheets joined like a primitive codex, coded in a pitch that slowed decay. There are no words, only a sequence of punched holes forming a ratio code. It looks suspiciously like a workshop template used to transfer proportions from plan to stone. The discovery electrifies the team. Could this be a transferable module, a portable blueprint for craftsmen teaching proportions in the field? If so, the temple's plan fits into a pedagogy, not merely a monument. Short wonder, a taught proportion. Late at night, when the tents go quiet and the scanners rest, one of the team members walks the preserved stair and touches the circle carved at its riser. She imagines the hands that first incise it, imagines the oath taught in shadow and flame to apprentices taking their first measure. The belief that knowledge must be guarded, taught, and ritualized threads through the site's architecture. Perhaps that was the blueprint's true power, not the geometry alone but the human institutions that enforced and transmitted it. Short, haunting, knowledge as ritual. A brief accounting paragraph. The discoveries so far supply a skeleton of interpretation, a built environment tuned for voice and resilience, a corpus of craft standards suggesting centralized training or guild oversight, trade links expressed through materials and diet, and a cultural memory that embeds knowledge physically where paper might fail. Each claim needs more data, more isotopic matches, clearer stratigraphic sequences, and careful cross-site comparison. The work is far from done, and the blueprint keeps its cards close. Short closing question for the moment. Will the blueprint surrender its final logic? A thin thread of dawn slides under the lintel and paints the central ring in a slow, widening halo. They discover the seam where a removed panel once sat, and beneath it, the hollow smell of old oils and the faint geometry of a lost inscription, letters worn to ghosts, but not entirely gone. A conservator traces the letters with a soft stylus, coaxing curves into intelligibility. The fragment reads more like an invocation to craft than a prayer to a named deity, a phrase that could be rendered as, "Keep the measure." Inscription fragment conserved. What voice needed such a reminder carved into stone? The team reconstructs the passage where the panel belonged and models how the light would have entered at sunrise on a particular day each year. Their simulation shows a narrow shaft of sunfall that would slide across the invocation and strike a recessed node, igniting a pigment that flashed like a signal. The effect is transient but unmistakable, a built calendar that used light to punctuate ritual speech. The blueprint contains not just lines for structure but choreography for time. Short, almost breathless, the stone becomes clock and stage. In a tent lit by laptop screens, the younger archaeologist opens an old ledger photograph and finds a sketch. That same phrase rendered in a hand that moves from careful to hurried across the page, as if the scribe's hand trembled with the urgency of preserving a formula. The photograph is labeled with a year that conflicts with a radiocarbon plateau. The discrepancy forces the team into a conversation about transmission. Was the phrase carved from an older oral precept or an evolving written standard? The ledger's scribe may have been copying a living rule rather than inventing one, and the presence of multiple copies in different hands would suggest institutional propagation. Short question: who copied the rule? The notion of institutions warps our image of ancient craft. Evidence of administrative oversight appears in small but telling artifacts: clay ceilings impressed with concentric sigils, each stamped by a slightly different hand but conforming to a common emblem. Sealed envelopes of plaster preserve fragments of directives, orders for timber grades, for pigment recipes, for dowel dimensions. The bureaucracy implied is modest but real, and it ties aesthetic choices to economic systems. A temple's blueprint is therefore also a ledger of governance. Short, crisp, governance in clay. Across the valley, in the ruins of a related complex, a collapsed archive offers thin wooden boards interleaved with oiled leather. With painstaking desalination, conservators reveal a series of punched cards, perforated templates mapping ratios rather than words. These templates function like portable rule sets, allowing builders to transfer proportions from master plan to worksite. The circulation of such templates across sites suggests a network that standardized taste and technique, a shared language of making that outlived individual makers. Memory persists in places people least expect. An elder woman takes the team to a courtyard where her grandmother once kept a chest of tools. She produces a spindle wheel carved with the same circle motif and a small story. The whorl was passed to her grandmother by a teacher who refused payment, demanding instead that the receiver learn to trace the circle correctly. This is not a ledger but a pedagogy enacted by gesture and object. The circle, then, is both mark and method, a way to teach proportion through touch. Short, pedagogy by touch. A late-season storm uncovers a previously hidden drain that channels rainwater into a buried cistern lined not with clay but with a fabricated composite of ash and crushed shell bound by resin. Chemical analysis shows the resin contains a polymerized compound unfamiliar to local botanical records. Its durability explains why some finishes have survived where others have not. Composite Analysis Lab. The technology encoded in the blueprint is both pragmatic and experimental. Recipes tested against seasons, materials chosen for endurance. The builders were engineers who apprenticed to the weather. Short assertion: recipes against time. Debates about authorship grow livelier as the evidence accumulates. One camp argues for a master architect, figure whose vision organizes the corpus. Another sees a collective, an evolving tradition where many hands iteratively refine and preserve a grammar. Both scenarios find support. The master explains consistent proportions and daring axial alignments. The collective explains persistent repairs and regional variations. Perhaps the truth is hybrid, a charismatic coordinator who worked within institutional frameworks that enabled replication and longevity. Short rumination, leader and collective. A striking new find complicates even these models. A hidden chamber below the sacrarium contains a wooden box sealed with pitch and wrapped in fabric. Inside is a simple instrument, a compass with a diameter ring inlaid with tiny drilled holes, each corresponding to a module used elsewhere on the site. The compass is practical and therefore intimate, a tool for on-site measurement, portable and precise. Whoever made the compass expected others to use it, to reproduce measures beyond one generation. The blueprint thus becomes a distributed technology, one that depends on tools as much as on stones. Short line: the compass circulates the craft. The social life of the temple hums in marginalia. Graffiti reveal laughter, rivalry, and devotion, apprentices mocking each other, masons' marks overlaying earlier signatures, a carved love knot in a forgotten stare. These human inscriptions anchor the grand theories to ordinary life. Someone joked while measuring, someone else pressed a name into wet mortar and walked away. The blueprint counts such moments among its material traces. Short human beat, laughter and stone. As the excavation continues, questions of ownership press against ethical guidelines. International teams arrive with equipment and funding. Local families demand a voice in decisions. Negotiations over repatriation of portable finds, over where to display fragile objects, and over who will write the narrative finally settle into uneasy compromises. The project learns to convene councils, to place copies of 3D models in village libraries, and to train local conservators who will steward the site after international teams depart. Conservation becomes a practice of shared custodianship rather than external rescue. Short, firm, custodianship shared. Late one afternoon, a school group visits, a small cluster of children leaning on a low wall, eyes bright at the sight of color-revealed pigments. A young girl points at a ring motif and asks if the marks mean home. The translator pauses, then renders the child's question as both literal and metaphoric. For the builders, the circle may indeed have marked belonging. The team, exhausted and exhilarated, answers with a simple demonstration, tracing the circle in dust, showing how a measure can be passed by hand. The lesson is immediate. The blueprint's true currency remains human transmission. Short, tender, belonging taught in dust. At night, the site breathes out the accumulated voices of a century of investigation. The instruments are shut down, and the only sound is the wind threading through broken cornices. In these quiet hours, theories sleep and the material speaks. The blueprint resists being pinned to a single explanation. Instead, it offers a braided account: technology and ritual, governance and pedagogy, local skill and long-distance exchange. Each thread is necessary to perceive the tapestry whole. Short, meditative, the tapestry resists single-handedness. With every layer peeled back, the blueprint's design logic reveals both the practical and the poetic. The concentric rings regulate movement and load, yes, but they also stage procession and sightline. The dowels and pins ensure longevity, but they also carry guild signatures. The result is an integrated artifact, architecture as encyclopedia. To read it well requires craftspeople, scientists, and storytellers working together, hands and instruments and voices in sync. Short insistence, multidisciplinary reading necessary. A scholar writes a reflection. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not the origin of the blueprint, but its deliberate choice to be durable in the face of fragile media. The builders made memory physical. The question persists: what did they hope to guarantee by carving governance into stone? The answer may lie somewhere between practical need and theological conviction, a wish that future hands would inherit both measure and meaning. Short, almost a promise, the stone keeps a pledge. Dawn shapes the central ring again, and for a moment the place seems to hold its breath, awaiting the next hand to trace the circle, the next voice to lift in the tuned nave. The blueprint endures not as a static artifact but as an active contract between past and future, a series of choices encoded to outlast any one life. If you stand in its center and listen, you might hear an implied oath: keep the measure, teach the hand, pass the circle on. A cold gust slides through an open joint and carries with it the smell of river silt and old pitch. A scanner picks up a pocket behind a dressed ashlar where a mason once left a tiny cavity and then hit it with precision. Inside is a rolled strip of beaten lead, folded like a leaf, its surface scratched with scores so fine they read almost like texture until a conservator brushes them with a solvent, and the marks bloom into something legible. A set of fraction-like notations and a miniature plan inlaid with the familiar circle motif. The notations appear to be a set of construction tolerances and a sequence for laying courses. A working hand's shorthand rather than a ritual text. Conservation Micrograph, 2024. Who would tuck such practical instruction into stone rather than in a workshop chest? Short, exact, a mason's secret. Scholars mapping the tiny plan overlay it on the larger temple blueprint and realize the pocketed strip is a key, a modular subplan that explains an otherwise puzzling sequence of staggered arches. When the subplan is aligned, an entire corridor's logic snaps into place. The previously anomalous offset becomes a hinge in the larger geometry, an intentional misalignment that routes light and footfall in a specific choreography. The act of hiding working details in the fabric of the building now reads as a deliberate redundancy, the plan that makes the plan. Why embed operational knowledge where only hands on site might find it? Short question: who should have access to the key? At dusk, a debate erupts over publication. One camp insists that releasing the module risks facilitating looting or unauthorized restoration by unskilled hands. Another argues that hiding working knowledge closes the loop on scholarship, preventing the broader craft community from learning and preserving the technique. The argument is not abstract. It shapes decisions about digital archives, about who gets access to high-resolution meshes, and about whether to patent a reconstruction technique that could stabilize crumbling vaults. Heritage is not neutral, it is contested in policy rooms as much as on the dig. Short, blunt, access shapes preservation. A graduate student runs the lead strip through multispectral imaging and finds ink residues invisible to the naked eye, oxide signatures that fluoresce under ultraviolet, revealing annotations in a different hand and in a tighter script. The secondary hand lays out a maintenance schedule, months for repointing, seasons for pigment renewal, a note to feed the cistern before the hot rains. This is not just construction instruction, it is an institutional maintenance plan, evidence that the blueprint anticipated caretaking across generations. Multispectral Study, 2023. Long-term care was part of the design, embedded as an instruction manual for the future. Short, practical, maintenance as prophecy. Outside the trench, an old sinus map, drawn by a 19th century surveyor and misfiled in a regional archive, turns up cross-references to a place name that no modern map lists. The name lingers in village songs as the Water House. When teams follow the archival bearings, LiDAR and magnetometry reveal a submerged terrace complex where stone alignments suggest a ceremonial linkage with the temple across the valley. LiDAR/magnetometry, recent. The blueprint thus points outward as well as inward, connecting built memory with landscape memory in a system of nodes. Was the temple one hub in an intentional network of water houses? Short, connecting, the network widens. One night, during a field recording, a local singer intones a short ritual chant that elders say was once sung when stones were set. The chant uses a cadence that, when played back and analyzed, resonates strongly with the temple's dominant acoustic frequency. Acoustic comparison, preliminary. The coincidence is tantalizing. Was the chant adapted to the stones, or were the stones tuned to the chant? How often do communities encode performance into masonry, allowing architecture and voice to co-produce meaning? Short, intimate, voice and stone entwined. A plaster shard yields a fragment of writing in a tight, angular script. Paleographers debate whether it belongs to the same script family as inscriptions found at coastal trading hubs. Paleographic Discussion, 2022. If so, the inscription provides one more thread tying this inland site into broader communicative networks. The existence of handwriting here suggests literate administration, orders and accounts, not just guild memory. Which group managed those accounts, and to whom were they accountable? Short, administrative, the ledger's shadow. The conservation team discovers evidence of an intentional palimpsest, earlier painted schematic lines under a later surface layer, their traces visible only under infrared reflectography. The older lines follow a different proportional system. Someone reworked them, adopting a new ratio and overlaying a fresh aesthetic. The palimpsest is a record of design evolution in situ, an argument made in paint and scraping rather than in text. Architectural grammar here is not static. It is a living language subject to dialects and reforms. What social process prompts a building to adopt a new grammar midlife? Short, historical, style as debate. Rumors of a subterranean cache gained traction in the village, fueled by a half-remembered tale of a traveler who claimed to have seen a labyrinth map traced on an old tile. The team follows a geophysical anomaly, a low resistivity zone under a sealed plinth, and carefully probes a void. Inside, they find a ring of small ceramic amulets arranged around a central stone. Each amulet bears the circle motif and a set of punch dots that may encode a numeric system. Rather than treasure in the conventional sense, the cache reads like a ritual deposit, offerings placed to seal the construction, tokens of oath and guardianship. Ritual Deposit Typology, 2015. The deposit confirms that material practices of protection and performance accompanied technical making. Short, ritual, offerings underfoot. A conflict erupts with developers planning irrigation canals that cut close to the terraces. Petitions, court filings, and emergency archaeology teams appear almost overnight. The site's survival becomes a legal instrument, a test of heritage law's teeth. The local community mobilizes, drawing on oral claims and documented continuity to argue for protection. Funding for the excavation is partially redirected to legal advocacy and community training programs. preservation becomes inseparable from local livelihoods. The blueprint's endurance now depends on law and politics as much as on mortar. Short, urgent, law as scaffold. A surprising find appears in the form of an inlaid gaming piece, an ivory disc with the circle motif and etched markers around its rim. Its wear pattern suggests repeated handling. The piece likely functioned in ritualized games or pedagogical drills that taught apprentices proportional thinking through play. The idea that instruction can be gamified is alluring. Perhaps the guild used playful exercises to internalize measurement and ratio before apprentices ever touched tools. How might play have shaped precision in the maker's hand? Short, playful, learning as game. When a visiting structural engineer runs a load model incorporating the unusual offsets represented in the subplan, the simulation reveals an elegant redundancy. The offsets redirect peak stresses into sacrificial zones, areas intended to fail first, preserving the more sacred core. The design is not brittle, it is strategic. Whoever wrote the blueprint anticipated decay and built in a means to manage it. Engineering here is anticipatory, blending craft with foresight. What cultural logic produces not only spectacular form but also planned obsolescence. Short, strategic fail-safes in stone. In the field lab, residue analysis of pigments uncovers a rare binder containing protein residues that match those found in coastal fish processing sites. Residue matching, 2021. The presence of a marine-derived adhesive in an inland temple suggests trade in more than prestige objects. It suggests the transfer of specific materials used for preservation. Trade networks thus supplied both luxury and technical supplies. How did the flows of these materials shape what builders could imagine? Short, trade-bound, materials as imagination. At a ceremonial evening, elders recount a story of an oath. Apprentices bound their hands with a loop of fiber and traced the circle before starting work. The ritualized action taught both humility and fidelity to measure. The loop, the circle, and the tracing together formed a pedagogy, gesture as mnemonic. Such rites, the elders insist, ensured fidelity across generations. Can ritual be considered a form of quality control as much as a symbolic act? Short, ritualized, oath as quality control. A discovery in a peripheral village upends assumptions about centralization. A small shrine contains a local variant of the circle motif, executed by hands less fluent in stone but equally committed to proportion in painted form. The local shrine's templates are simpler, adapted to house-scale work, but they share enough grammar to suggest knowledge diffusion rather than imposition. The blueprint's reach is not a map of authority but of adaptation, technique taking root and being remade to fit local means. How does knowledge change as it migrates? Short, adaptive, technique remade. The team maps a line of sight between the temple and a distant hilltop at dawn of a particular date, and notices an alignment with a natural cleft where dawn light cleaves the rock in a narrow band. The alignment is precise to within a few degrees, survey data, 2022. The ritual calendar encoded in the blueprint thus extends to natural features. The built and the wild are coordinated in a performance of dawn. The choreography of stone and sky raises questions about cosmology and territorial display. Who benefits when ritual timing maps to landscape spectacle? Short, cosmic, sky and stone in dialogue. Late in the campaign, a small terracotta plaque surfaces bearing a schematic that is neither strictly plan nor pure ornament. It resembles a hybrid, a map stitched with ritual notation and a series of punched holes that correspond to the dots on the amulets found beneath the plinth. When the punched holes are interpreted as a simple cipher, perhaps a counting system or mnemonic, the plaque reads as an index. Where the circle meets water, remember the keeper's name. The keeper's name is effaced. For a moment, the site's layers conspire to give a clue and then deny the rest. The puzzle compels further digging, not just in soil but in songs and myth. Where will the next clue lie? Behind another dressed stone, in an elder's pocket, or in the archives of a distant town? A shaft of afternoon sun slices the dust into gold, and the air smells faintly of pine tar and old paper. They unseal another niche and find, pressed between two dressed stones, a folded scrap of fabric stiff with pitch. Under magnification a pattern of tiny embroidered knots appears, an encoded stitch language whose repeats map almost perfectly onto the temple's ring modules, textile microanalysis, comparative motif study. The stitch is not decorative alone, it reads as a mnemonic loop, a tactile script to be read by touch in low light. Who taught hands to read by feel, and why hide that teaching in cloth rather than in stone? Short, tactile, knowledge sown. In a dense conversation that lasts until the headlamp batteries drain, the team constructs an argument about redundancy. The builders embedded knowledge across media, stone, wood, textile, clay discs, creating overlapping, redundant systems. Redundancy ensured survival. If paper rotted, cloth remained. If cloth frayed, a dowel pin or an incised ring preserved the ratio. The plan was thus a living library distributed across craft forms, resilient to the hazards that devour single media. What does it take for a knowledge system to survive centuries of climate, conflict, and neglect? Short, insistent, survive the hazards. On a clear night, researchers map a faint constellation of small cairns on a nearby ridge and realize the cairns mirror the temple's outer ring pattern at a reduced scale. Field alignment, 2023. The cairns mark sightlines. Lights placed there on specific dates would signal processional timing across miles. The blueprint reaches not just across materials but across terrain, maps written on Earth as much as on ashlar. Was this a communication network, an early semaphore for ritual? A way to time movement across a landscape in concert? Short, distant, signals in stone. A conservator carefully peels back layers of varnish on a painted panel and reveals an earlier schematic beneath. A star map aligned with an obsolete celestial coordinate system. The stars depicted no longer occupy the indicated positions due to precession. The map dates the panel to a time when the sky read differently. The panel may encode an astronomical epoch now shifted, a deliberate anchoring of ritual to a sky that has moved on. How do rituals anchored to specific celestial configurations adapt as the heavens change? Short, astronomical, sky's slow drift. Field notes record an unusual discovery. A series of small sockets carved into a lower plinth that match the diameters of the ivory gaming piece and the ceramic amulets. The sockets form a sequence along a course where apprentice masons once knelt. The sequence's spacing suggests it functioned as a training strip, an embodied exercise to drill proportion by repetition. The young were taught muscle memory in place, measure, mark, cut, repeat. Skill was not merely taught, it was inscribed into the body. Short, embodied, learning by repetition. A bitter debate unfolds in a conference tent when a visiting historian argues the blueprint's reach implies a proto-bureaucratic formation, an early administrative apparatus that standardized production across political units. Opponents push back, warning that technological similarity does not equate to centralized control. Local agencies could have borrowed modules without political unification. The argument is academic but heated because it changes how we imagine the social landscape that birthed the plan: centralized state, guild network, or federated practice? Which social structure best accounts for a distributed technology of making? Short, urgent, structure matters. In the field lab, a set of microfossils trapped in lime mortar points to seasonal harvesting of coastal algae used in binders. Microfossil analysis, 2021. The identification suggests not only trade in goods but in specialized processing techniques, biological knowledge transferred with material. This is a trade in recipes as well as in objects. How many innovations moved alongside cargo? What craft knowledge traveled hidden inside a barrel of traded goods? Short question, recipes in cargo. A child scribbles a new circle in dust before the conservators can photograph an exposed molding. An elder laughs and remarks that children always find a way to echo what adults preserve. The simple act is a reminder that living communities continue to perform variation on the blueprint in everyday gestures. The circle returns in play, in pottery rims, in the weave of baskets still made nearby. Heritage is not only what specialists rescue, it is what people continue to do. Short, warm, continuity in play. A late-season survey reveals a small outlying workshop where the stone is coarser and the style cruder, yet within its debris lie molds and punches that replicate the central temple's emblem in reduced form. The outlying workshop probably served smaller commissions and domestic shrines, Translating the Blueprint's Grammar to Vernacular Scales, Workshop Distribution Study, 2022. The presence of such translation sites argues for a flexible diffusion. Technique moves, adapts, and democratizes. How do makers negotiate aspiration and resource limitation when translating a canonical plan for local use? Short, practical, translation of scale. An older villager offers a story about a vanished corridor once known as the Listening Walk. He remembers elders walking there during drought, counting the echoes and whispering names of springs. The team models the corridor's acoustic decay and finds that certain whisper frequencies travel surprisingly far, enough for two people to converse across the span without raised voice. Acoustic Decay Model, 2020. The corridor's design thus served both poetic and practical functions, a place to test water memory and to transmit names across distance. Ritual and engineering braided again. Short, resonant, speaking distance. A manuscript in a regional archive, misfiled under cadastral records, yields a line item, payment to Master Q. The payment's date corresponds to a dendrochronological date obtained from a roof beam sample. The coincidence is small but precise, a named individual aligned with a measured timber felling. The ledger is not the entire story, but it is an anchor in a sea of uncertain dates. Who was Master Q? What apprentices answered to him? The ledger provides human names to a place that otherwise speaks through anonymous craft. Short naming, a ledger's gift. During a conservation exercise, an apprentice replicates an ashlar joint using tools reconstructed from found fragments. The process is slow, demanding, and revealing. The apprentice learns that the ideal tolerances recorded in the blueprint are not mathematical alone but commensurate with the limits of available tools and human musculature. The blueprint's precision emerges as a negotiated regime. What can be achieved reliably by hands and tools over time? How much of the plan was ambition, and how much was humble adaptation to human capacity? Short, hands-on, ambition met by hand. A late-night raid of looters near the site triggers swift communal action. Villagers, archaeologists, and local police form a human chain that reclaims a group of stolen fragments from a jeep's trunk. The incident spotlights the precariousness of material culture in a market that rewards rarity. It also sharpens the project's focus on community engagement, security, education, and shared guardianship become as central to the blueprint's survival as conservation labs. What price do we ask communities to pay for preservation, and who pays for vigilance? Short, urgent, guardianship costs. A new isotopic match links a zinc-rich ingot found in an outcrop to a mining site hundreds of kilometers away, and the implication ripples through the team. The ingot's presence in the temple deposit suggests exchange systems that move not only finished goods but raw, strategic inputs essential to technology. The blueprint's materiality depended on far-flung extraction and negotiation. How did such supply chains survive in a world without modern logistics? Short, networked, supply webs. One afternoon, a senior conservator lifts a thin plate of mica hidden behind an altar and discovers on its underside a faded diagram. Stops and starts of a mason's hand, mistakes rubbed out and corrected. The image humanizes the author of craft. They were fallible, revising ratios, improving lines. The blueprint is thus not pure dogma but a practice amenable to correction. The presence of correction suggests communities that allowed revision and debated standards. Is a blueprint alive when it can be changed? Short, humane, mistakes corrected. They open a sealed well and find, at its bottom, a cluster of folded notes, sealed with resin, modern editions, placed by villagers over the last century as petitions for rain. Among these is a small, careful drawing of the circle motif made by a hand now elderly but steady. The drawing proves that the motif persists in living memory, that continuity is not merely archaeological but in folk practice. The well supplies water and history, and the petitioner's small folded papers are part of an ongoing archive of hope. Short, intimate, petitions in resin. The night before the last scheduled season's closure, the team gathers in the nave for one last listening session. They play an old reed tune, trace a circle in the dust, and pass a simple tool from hand to hand. The act is both farewell and promise. Researchers will return, But in the meantime they commit to training local custodians, to sharing digital copies, and to ensuring the site remains woven into village life. The blueprint survives best where people care for it daily, not just when satellites pass overhead. Short, covenant, stewardship renewed. A final, small mystery remains unbroken. In a sealed pocket beneath the sacristy floor, conservators find a chip of obsidian with a minute-incised map, so small it requires a jeweler's lens to read. The incising points north by an angle that does not match magnetic declination. Instead it aims toward a hilltop 2 valleys away where a cluster of megaliths once stood, now lost beneath scrub and roadwork. The obsidian's incised line suggests a relationship between sites that the current campaign has barely begun to trace. Who carried such a tiny map, and for whom was it intended? Short, beckoning, a path continues. If you stood now where the masts of lanterns fall into a single circle on the floor, what would you believe the architect intended? The perfection of proportion, the choreography of sound, a civic ledger in stone, or an ethic of care transmitted by touch? The blueprint refuses a simple answer. It offers instead a life of possible readings, each plausible and none complete. The work ahead is not only to read the stones but to listen to the people who keep them warm. A long breath of wind moves through the nave and scatters a fine rain of lime dust. The particles hang, momentary constellations caught in a shaft of light. They convene for a final sunrise on the last day of fieldwork. The team, villagers, and a handful of visiting students stand in a loose ring. Someone places the compass on the flagstone. Hands, old and young, set fingers on its rim. For a heartbeat the place is a living classroom, gestures suturing inquiry to memory. What will future hands make of this lesson? Short, bright, the compass passes hand to hand. Technical reports will follow, isotopic charts, thermoluminescence curves, acoustic frequency graphs, lighter meshes that fold the ruined terraces back into coherent plans. The papers will argue in footnotes and appendices about phases and provenance, about whether the dowels came from a distant or a nearby seam. Those debates matter because they refine the skeleton of facts on which the richer story can cling. Yet the facts alone do not complete the picture, they are the scaffolding for meaning. Denser paragraph, the scaffold of evidence supports many interpretations, and each interpretive frame opens a different door to understanding. Seen as civic architecture, the blueprint shows a polity capable of regulation and pedagogy. Seen as ritual theater, it reads as choreography for voice and light. Seen as guild practice, it reveals an apprenticeship system that weaponized touch and rhythm to guarantee fidelity. None of these readings is exclusive. The site's power lies in their intersection. The architect, whether solitary genius or convening mind of a craft network, chose redundancy and pedagogy as insurance against time. That choice is the masterpiece, the intentional scattering of knowledge across media so that measure may survive the accidents that befall fragile texts. A thin smile crosses an elder's face as she remembers a childhood game, tracing circles in dust at dawn, counting stones as if they were syllables in a prayer. The game becomes a mnemonic for a people and a geometry for a craft. The motif is modest, a circle, but its persistence is profound. Why does a simple loop stitch together governance, ritual, engineering, and pedagogy? Perhaps because a circle is both measure and metaphor, measure for the hand, metaphor for belonging. Short, vivid, children count stones like syllables. Under a table in the field lab, a small box carries the most unassuming of verdicts, a sequence of tiny punched cards, a compass rim, a bead, an apprentice's thumbprint pressed into token clay. These are not treasures in the way loot hunters imagine treasure. They are manuals for action, portable, durable, and intimate. They tell us how someone taught another to see proportion, how they taught a hand to be steady, how they taught a community to care. The blueprint is therefore a pedagogy disguised as architecture. Denser paragraph, pedagogy here is not abstract, it is tactile and social. The apprentices learn by repetition along measured strips, by the oblique counsel of elders and the play of a game. The guild, if indeed it was a guild, bound technique with oath and ritual. The community, for its part, rehearsed care by binding stones into cisterns and by leaving offerings at the feet of newly set courses. The lesson is reciprocal. The blueprint shaped social habit as much as social structure shaped the blueprint. That reciprocity is the human engineering that keeps material culture alive. At midday, a small thunderstorm washes the dust from a carved ring, and for a moment the motif flashes like an eye. The team retreats under canvas and debates the ethics of publication. What to release, what to withhold. How much digital fidelity to grant the public, and how much to limit in the interest of protection. They decide, collectively and imperfectly, to publish core findings while holding back sensitive locational data, to train local stewards, and to deposit high-resolution models in village libraries alongside translated summaries. Knowledge, they conclude, thrives best when shared responsibly. Short, decisive, knowledge shared responsibly. There remains the question of authorship, a comfortable anchor for storytellers who prefer names to processes. They find ledger entries that name a master Q. They identify tool marks consistent with a particular workshop. They see the arc patterns executed with a hand that knows the compass intimately. Yet the project resists a tidy biography. The blueprint's authorship is both personal and communal, an initiating mind whose choices were carried, contested, revised, and ritualized by many hands. The author of the plan is therefore not only the draftsman who first incised the circle, but the network that sustained it. Denser paragraph. Human names matter. They humanize the past and make stewardship ethically urgent. But attribution must not collapse complexity into singular personality. The fullest portrait of creation honors both the one and the many, celebrates the leader without erasing the craft that made his or her vision durable. In doing so, we guard against hero-making that divorces technique from the social systems, apprenticeship, trade, ritual, that made it possible. Night falls, and with it the soft conversation of those who remain. A conservator reads aloud a passage from a ledger found in another valley, a line that translates roughly as, "Feed the cistern before the hot rains." Practical wisdom carved into an administrative practice. The line makes them laugh and shiver, the same blend of domesticity and foresight that the stones seem to enforce. The laughter is relief, the shiver, reverence. They sense in these small directives a continuity of care that links present to past. Short, domestic, feed the cistern before the rains. The last act of the campaign is modest and human. They fill a small box with replicas, a compass, a punch card, a clay token stamped with a circle, a printed guide in the local language describing how to read an ashlar joint. They hand the box to village elders with a promise: keep these lessons, teach your children, and call us back if the stones need us. It is a covenant rather than a contract, a loop that closes the brief intervention and opens a long-term commitment. Denser paragraph. Commitments matter because conservation is not a rescue mission with a tidy end but a process that outlives any single season. The project's legacy will be measured less in papers than in empowered custodians, in children who learn to read proportion as naturally as letters, in commons preserved not by fences but by practice. The blueprint, preserved in such ways, will continue to instruct and to bind community memory to material practice. At dawn on their final morning, the team assembles at the threshold. A child draws a circle in the dust. An apprentice follows with a careful measuring stick. The elder who taught the circle years ago draws a slow breath and places her hand over the child's. For a moment time folds, past, present, and future touching like stones repointed in mortar. There is no triumphant revelation, no final unmasking. There is instead a quiet passing of method, a lived assurance that the measure will endure. Short, tender, hand upon hand. If you stand now where the circle sits, what will you find? You will find a geometry that held community and sound and law in a single plan. You will find a pedagogy that taught hands to measure and hearts to keep. You will find a people who chose to make their memory durable and to trust future hands with its care. The blueprint, in the end, is less a mystery to be solved than a contract to be honored. Final dense paragraph. The stones keep their own counsel, but they also hold invitations. They invite scholars to test assumptions and children to play with proportion. They invite communities to steward and to teach. They invite you, wherever you stand, to imagine how knowledge travels, not only by paper or parade but by compass rim, by punch card, by thumbprint pressed into clay. Such transmission is noisy, inhuman, and imperfect. It survives in layers, palimpsest upon palimpsest, each generation adding its correction and its care. Our duty is to read these layers with humility, to act with stewardship, and to remember that the most durable blueprints are those that include a plan for their own caretakers. A last silence follows, dense with rain and possibility. The circle remains, patient as a promise. The blueprint, etched, sewn, punched, played, has done what it was designed to do. It taught measure, it taught maintenance, and it taught fidelity across time. In a world inclined to value spectacle, its quiet genius is to be ordinary enough to be kept.